Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Tom Pickerel. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Tuna Alliance. This is the latest in a suite of webinars coordinated by the Global Tuna Alliance to support signatories in meeting the Tuna 2020 Traceability Declaration. Today's webinar is going to be on Regional Fishery Management Organisations, or RFMOs, and will be presented by me. If I could ask you to please keep your microphones on mute during the webinar to avoid any feedback issues and background noise, that would be much appreciated. I would love to hear from you. There will be plenty of time for questions at the end. Feel free to jot questions down in the group chat or save them to the end, whatever works for you. And okay, so for those of you just joining, I'm delighted to kick off this webinar on RFMOs. So I just thought I'd begin with a brief introduction to the Global Tuna Alliance. The Global Tuna Alliance, as says on this slide here, is an independent group of retailers and supply chain companies. And our aim is to collaborate together, work together to ensure that the tuna in the supply chains ultimately meets the highest standards of environmental performance and social responsibility. Now, originally, the Global Tuna Alliance was set up primarily to focus on regional fishery management organisations. The founding companies were concerned that the regional fisheries management organisations, or RFMOs, weren't operating as well as they should be, and it was having an impact on the sustainability of the tuna fisheries they source from, and that in turn was having an impact on their own seafood sourcing policies. Coincidentally, at the same time, the World Economic Forum launched their Tuna 2020 Traceability Declaration, of which many companies who have joined the call are signatories to. The GTA and the World Economic Forum came together, and last year the World Economic Forum decided to fully fund the Global Tuna Alliance until December 2020. One of the reasons for that is that the GTA can actually assist them in implementing the Tuna 2020 Traceability Declaration commitments. And those are tuna traceability, social responsibility, environmental sustainability, and government partnerships. Now, I put government partnerships in bold because this is the area that is the sort of most linked to the regional fishery management organisations. So what does the Tuna 2020 Traceability Declaration commitment on government partnerships say? These are the three areas that's in the commitment. So there is a call to industry leaders who have signed the declaration to work with governments to take actions needed to do the following. The first one, implement harvest strategies. Now that is something that is very much under the jurisdiction of each tuna regional fishery management organisation. The second part is about establishing systems to identify and restrict IUU seafood through initiatives that governments are implementing on traceability and transparency. And a lot of these can be coordinated through the regional fishery management organisations. The final point really relates to the FAO Code of Conduct and Port State Measures Agreement, and that's kind of out of scope for this this discussion here. That's sort of, it is linked to regional fishery management organisations, but it does go beyond that. So I won't be touching on that in this presentation. We had a webinar on the Port State Measures Agreement by our colleagues at Pew a couple of weeks ago, and the slides are now uploaded to the GTA website. So why are RFMOs so important? Well, tuna are, if you don't know, are highly migratory, and they don't pay much attention to national EEZs, or economic exclusion zones, exclusive economic zones. So they swim between waters on the high seas away from areas of national control. There are 5 tuna regional fishery management organisations. They're commonly known as tuna RFMOs or TRFMOs, but I just refer to them as RFMOs, established to manage tuna and other highly migratory species, such as the billfishes, which include swordfish and marlin. Now, you can see them on the map there. These are the 5. We're really interested in the ones in bold, the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission, the West Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, the Inter-Americas Tropical Tuna Commissions, and the and ICAT, the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas, which also includes the Mediterranean Sea. We're not interested so much in the Commission for the Conservation of Southern Bluefin Tuna, because the most of the commercial tunas that we're involved in the GTA are not bluefin. So we're dealing with these ones here. The RFMOs are formed by the countries with fishing interests in these areas, either in the region itself, when you refer to as a coastal state, or you have flag vessels or fishing interests in there. So, for example, the European Union sits on the IOTC because they have European Union fishing interests in that region. But now the UK has left the EU, we will also be IOTC partners, participating countries, because of the British territory in the Indian Ocean. So you can see how it works there. Some of the RFMOs are open to all the countries, like as mentioned, and they have management powers to do things like set catch and fishing effort limits, technical measures, and control obligations for tuna and associated species. And by that, it also includes bycatch. So they're incredibly important. These guys are the ones who are responsible for the management of tuna there. So this is why they're so important. Without RFMOs operating effectively, we are not going to get well-managed tuna fisheries. So what about the importance of the market engagement of RFMOs? And I've got a graphic here, and this is pretty much how things happen at the moment at RFMOs. You have the delegates, and the delegates are open to engagement. They're open to lobbying. And at the moment, there is some lobbying from the NGO community, and I've got a small arrow there because it's not the most effective, despite a lot of very good engagement by NGOs towards RFMOs, but there's no commercial voice there, so it's not often acted upon. There are some exceptions there. You have the science committee, which is actually a body of each RFMO. They have their own science committee, and their role is to produce management advice and other forms of advice and information, and they are listened to sometimes. And then you have the catching sector, which is probably the most effective lobbyists of the RFMOs. They're very efficient, very well organised, and they have the ear of the delegates. Sometimes the catching sector can be supported by the NGO community, for example, particularly if they're sharing improvement needs, for example, in a certified fishery that has improvement needs and conditions, or in a FIP, for example. So that's very much a rough outline of a general situation. This is what we're looking to get, a situation that looks a little bit more like this. So we have the same situation, but we also now have the supply chain, and I'm explicitly excluding catching sector from the supply chain. So that's people sort of in the supply chain I'm not incorporating the catching sector. So processors, distributors, retail, food service, for example. I'd very much like them to have a voice with the RFMO delegates to explain what they want, the importance of the actions that they need for their tuna to meet requirements. Now, it's not just going to be like this. There is obviously a role for NGO community, and I don't just mean environmental NGOs, to support the supply chain in their asks of RFMOs, but also the supply chain can influence the catching sector. That's where they get the tuna from. They can certainly provide support and the clear asks to the catching sector. We can feed back into the RFMOs as well. So this is kind of the importance of the market in RFMO engagement, and why we're putting so much effort into this. It's important to note that there's a lot of people in this space, a lot of people calling for action, calling for asks. At a previous time, say 2 or 3 years ago, there certainly was a lot of feedback that businesses were very keen to support these asks, but the one thing they wanted was some clarity and some consistency. I'll give one example I heard firsthand was, I'd very much like to support the asks of the WCPFC, but I received 7 letters from different NGOs asking for slightly different things, and we just decided to do none. So that was a problem that the NGO community was facing, and 3 years ago, an organization called the Global NGO Tuna Forum was established, and the aim there was to bring together organizations, some of which are listed on the right there, to work together collaboratively and agree on the priority asks for tuna fisheries. And that's not to say everyone must agree on everything, and it's not to say that there's other areas of priority outside of these core asks, but there was enough overlap for the groups to get together and say, yes, these are the areas that we believe are the ones that need action first. So the forum offers it's a collaborative approach that avoids duplication. So the aim is so you don't receive lots of different asks. Avoid confusion, so you don't get lots of different asks, so we can be very clear on what the priorities are, and maximize the amplification of the priorities. So if you get a letter saying all these NGOs plus these representative organizations are saying these are the things that are most important, then hopefully this will resonate with you to say, yes, these are issues we need to back. The reason I've included the NGO Tuna Forum here is that the Global Tuna Alliance is actually an observer of this, as stated in the first bullet. So we attend the meetings and we contribute to that, and I find it a very, very useful relationship. Something else I wanted to highlight about a joined-up approach. We at the Global Tuna Alliance are partnered with an organisation called the Tuna Protection Alliance, which is based in France and coordinated by the French NGO called the Earthworm Foundation. They work with the canned tuna sector, both all the way through the supply chain from catches up to retail and food service. They're very much focused on sustainability, tuna sustainability sourcing, on vessel behavior, for example, but they're also acutely aware of the importance of RFMOs, and they don't have a great deal of expertise or resources to work on this area. So we have agreed joint RFMO positions in 2020. So everything I'm talking about in the next step of the presentation is actually signed off by TUPA as well. So what this means is when we go into meetings and we're saying, the following companies are calling for action, we're actually representing all the GTA partners as well as the TUPA partners as well, which is a super step. So what are we asking of the RFMOs then? So I thought we've got a separate section here to walk through what our asks are. These are our core 2020 RFMO engagement priorities. The box at the top are issues that are of relevance to all 4 tuna RFMOs identified there, and the separate ones are individual priorities per RFMO. This has been discussed as well at the Global NGO Tuna Forum, and with one exception, the inclusion of longline bycatch mitigation in the coordinated asks, it is identical. The reason why the GTA doesn't have longline bycatch as an area on the top there is purely because we don't really deal with individual gear types. We much prefer dealing with things on a whole. So our issue there would be bycatch mitigation rather than one specific gear type. But it is a very small point, and that's purely to do with the preference of the partners involved. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through each of these about why they are a priority. So starting with the first one, accelerating action on the development harvest strategies. In its simplest form, a harvest strategy provides a framework to ensure that fisheries managers, the fishers themselves, and other stakeholders consider and report on document responses to various fisheries conditions, both good and bad, before they occur. So essentially, providing a framework for decision making to say if the stock goes up, that we can increase effort, for example. If the stock goes down, we can reduce it. And you do this in a predetermined set out way. And this provides greater certainty and avoids ad hoc decision making, of which the RFMOs are absolutely renowned for. So this is the sort of the horse trading that goes on for several days, and then a decision is sort of rushed at the end of it. So the idea of a harvest strategy, which is a keystone of good fisheries management in any species, is to have these in place. So this is really the #1 priority for all RFMOs. This document here is a table I've taken from a report that ISSF have done. It's an incredibly useful report, and I've just picked some stocks from the West Pacific, Eastern Pacific, Northern and Southern Pacific for the albacore and the Indian Ocean, just some key stocks there. And this is the stock sustainability performance relative to the P1 MSC criteria there. And what you'll see is that there is a big gap on the 1.21 and 1.22 harvest strategy and harvest control rules and tools. And you see there's a lot of fails and there's a lot of yellow, which means there's conditions to be met. And in fact, it's only the Eastern Pacific yellowfin that would get that sort of clear pass on the harvest strategy and harvest control rules. So this is an area that the RFMOs are not doing very well on. And I understand there are 3 of the 19 main commercial tuna species actually have harvest strategies and harvest control rules in place at the moment. So this is something that is restricting fisheries being able to demonstrate condition-free MSC, and it's probably also restricting fisheries in fishery improvement projects or FIPs from getting to that level. I've got a slide here called MSC alignment. This is a slide that MSC have produced. It's very helpful. What it does, it shows you where in each of the ocean for the following species, if there are harvest strategies, harvest control rules in place, or when there is a commitment to deliver that from the RFMO themselves. Now, this is really important. These dates are really important because these are the dates that the RFMOs have said that they will have harvest strategies in place. Now, harvest strategies are a component part of the RFMOs. It's in their agenda. They have to deliver them. So these are the times. Now, I'll come back to the importance of this, but you can see this is something that is, not only is it needed, but it is something that is on the agenda. It is something that the RFMOs should be doing. So it's incredibly important that effort is put in place to put pressure on the RFMOs to deliver these. The second part, 100% observer coverage on longline and transshipment vessels. That's the second priority ask. Several RFMOs have implemented 100% observer coverage requirement for large-scale purse seiners, and yet the requirement is often 5% for longline tuna vessels, despite being consistent ongoing scientific recommendations, internal recommendations, that this be increased and also increased for small-scale purse seine vessels as well. Observer data from these purse seiners with 100% coverage is used for compliance with management measures, and it really is essential for independent verification of catch, effort, interactions with associated species, including endangered, threatened, or protected species as well. But conversely, there is a paucity of such data from longline vessels because of the low level of coverage, including on transshipment vessels. Now, this really hinders effective conservation and management of tuna stocks, as well as providing a block in confirming compliance with any regulations. 100% observer coverage requirements will level the playing field by ensuring that all parties are playing by the same rules. That's like the sort of the overarching one. But without 100% observer coverage on these industrial tuna vessels, there are far too many unknown risks lurking across tuna supply chains. It doesn't have to be people on boats. 100% observer coverage can be human or electronic. Advances in electronic monitoring or EM systems, along with the sort of well-established use of human observers, make this a really feasible requirement right now. Many of the conservation and compliance problems we see in tuna, including IUU fishing, misreported or underreported catches, bycatch of endangered, threatened, protected species, can be mitigated with this independent monitoring. So it's incredibly important that 100% observer coverage comes into play sooner rather than later. There's nothing preventing it except the will of the RFMOs. Next one I'm going to talk about is reforming the regulations of at-sea transshipment. These are transshipment. You can see the transshipment mothership there, taking a load of catch from the smaller vessel. Now, at-sea transshipment of catch between vessels plays a large and a very important role in global commercial fishing, not just tuna. Each year, hundreds of refrigerated cargo vessels or motherships take tuna that's been caught by thousands of longline fishing vessels and bring it to shore for processing. In the last 5-10 years, at-sea transshipment has increased significantly. For example, in IATTC, or the Eastern Pacific, it grew by 67% between 2012 and 2017, with Big Eye and albacore making up the largest proportion of the transfers. Now, while transshipment has increased, and it has increased in all RFMOs, the management regulations have not kept pace with the best practices, such as those that have been published and recommended by the the Global NGO Tuna Forum. For example, many RFMOs do not require the carrier vessels to be flagged to a contracting party or cooperating non-member of the RFMO. Reports are not always required to be submitted in near real time, and the observer reports are not required to be shared with appropriate authorities. There's just not enough independent data that's appropriately or timely shared to allow for effective monitoring and compliance with the transfers. And these gaps create risks, not just for fisheries, but for labour and human rights abuses. Can also reduce observer safety, create opportunities for IUU, fraud, catch laundering, etc. It can also undermine traceability, the provision of data that's necessary for the fisheries management by the RFMOs, and the effective implementation of any bycatch mitigation measures. So it's at the moment, the situation is not great. These are examples of best practice that could be brought into play by the RFMOs. The Global NGO Tuna has produced a great resource on best practice for at-sea transshipments. I can certainly share that link to the report. You can see here, there's a number of different ones here, very simple measures that can be implemented reasonably quickly by the RFMOs. You can see the link in with the observer coverage there. That was obviously, we talked about transshipment in the 100% observer coverage as well, so there's that link there. But simple things like IMO numbers, having the vessels identified on vessel lists used by the RFMOs, and requiring the submission of data in near real time. So it's all set out what is needed. Again, it's political will that's required here. The final one I'm going to talk about that applies to all four is developing a comprehensive FAD management program. So what's a FAD? A FAD, or fishery aggregating device, is something that's often a man-made raft. It doesn't have to be. It can be some logs. It can be a dead whale, for example, floating. And what it does is it tracks smaller fish, which in turn attracts larger fish who like the shelter. And you can put your nets around the aggregation of the fish and catch tuna. And that's the simple, sort of very simple definition. FAD use has increased significantly in recent decades, boosted by evolutions of FADs that have made them more effective. Pew did a report in 2015. They estimated there could be over 120,000 FADs deployed annually. So that's not just 120 FADs in the water, but deployed annually. Over 40% of the global catch is currently caught using FADs, using floating objects, including FADs, I should say. But they can have a large impact on both stocks and the broader marine ecosystem. For example, in terms of the impact on stocks, small and juvenile big eye and yellowfin also gather around FADs. And although the fishing vessels may not be targeting those fish, FAD use can lead to unsustainable catches of one or both of these species, depending on where the fishing is occurring, if it's not properly managed. FADs can also cause the death of ETP, endangered, threatened or protected species, such as sharks and turtles, which can get tangled up in the webbing or caught accidentally when the per se nets are pulled in. FADs can pollute and damage habitats. The picture on the left is one that's been washed up on a beach. This is in part because legal ownership is often unclear. Vessels can fish on any FADs they find, whether it's deployed by them or encountered by chance. And often FADs can be treated as disposable, so they can end up contributing to marine pollution as well. Each of the RFMOs has begun to grapple with how best to manage FAD use, but it's probably fair to say current management measures remain inadequate. These are some, in a similar vein to the previous slides I had on, these are some best practices that can be applied in a RFMO context. They are feasible as regulatory policies. They do not require development of any new technologies to put in place in the near term. And I'm not for a minute suggesting these are an exhaustive list, but certainly are a starting point for best practice. And what I've tried to do here is group them into some measures that can reduce bycatch. For example, biodegradable FADs, so you don't have ghost fishing going on. There's still a lot of work to be done on defining that. Non-entangling, so that's reducing the amount of netting and other material that dangles down from the FAD. And again, a couple of RFMOs are actually implementing that. Improving the management of FADs, but in terms of limits on numbers and deploying limits, as well as recovery and retrieval of FADs. And that's also linked to the reducing the debris, which is also about making sure that you're aware of them. It's not just throwing them in the water and forgetting about them. So again, these are policies that can be put in place. And again, we're just needing that political will. Okay, so we're now going to move on to the individual RFMO asks. So we're going to start with the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission. The ask here is for a rebuilding plan for yellowfin tuna that will rebuild the stock in 2 generations. And I put a little asterisk there because it's just a reminder really for myself to say that the GTA is actually producing some independent management advice to support the RFMO here. The IOTC Science Committee did not produce any management advice for yellowfin tuna at its meeting in December. And we have decided that one thing we can contribute to this is actually supporting them with the production of independent management advice that could be taken in their decision making. So the previous slide's obviously talking about rebuilding. So what's the current situation with yellowfin in the Indian Ocean? Well, it's overfished and subject to overfishing. The graph on the left is the fishing mortality, and you can see it has been increasing steadily, and it's now to a position where it is the fishing mortality is such that it's been overfished, and the stock size has, not surprisingly, gone down, and so it's now in a position where the stock is overfishing. Overfishing is occurring to the fishing mortality and overfish of the stock. So this is the worst position that a fishery can be in. Well, it's obviously not the worst, it means there's no fish left, but it's a bad situation for a fishery to be in. So this is not news to the IOTC, and in fact, there's been a couple of iterations of a rebuilding plan that's never quite managed to work due to a number of issues, one of which being people not following the rules in terms of overfishing what they're allowed, but secondly, also the fact that the effort reductions have never been quite enough. There were 3 proposals in 2019 put forward to the IOTC calling for 8 to 13% reduction in catch from 2017 levels. What was actually agreed was a 10% catch reduction. As you can see from this projection model, and remember models are as good as the data, but it clearly shows here using this model that 10% catch reduction will not change much. All it will do is slow down the decrease. And if you follow this model, what we should have been looking at was around about a 25% overall catch reduction to bring that fishery, bring that stock back into the not overfished and not overfishing area. The second thing we want to do at IOTC is talk about skipjack harvest control rules. We mentioned harvest strategies and harvest control rules earlier. There is a harvest control rule for skipjack in the Indian Ocean, which was a great achievement. It defined an annual catch limit from 2018 to 2020 of 470,000 tons, which was good because that fishery at sort of the latest information is not in a position of being overfished. However, the catches in 2018, so this is the catches, were 29% larger than the catch limit, and this has followed a trend of the last 3 years. Now, this is bad because it is falling under the definition of unregulated, which will mean that this fishery could legitimately be described as IUU. This is not only putting 2 MSC certifications in the region, as well as one that's under certification, but also commercial sourcing policies for companies that said, we do not wish to source from fisheries that are engaged in IUU. So this is about getting the IOTC back on track with the harvest control rules and reiterating to the delegates that there is this harvest strategy in place and it must be followed. So moving on to IATTC, this is the Inter-Americas Tropical Tuna Commission, or Eastern Pacific. This one's relatively straightforward, I would hope. The current conservation management measure for the tropical tunas in this region expires this year. And so our priority is to get the RFMO to agree another measure. I know that sounds pretty straightforward, but it's not automatic, and so pressure needs to be brought to bear on the delegates to ensure that this is not only is it a priority, but that the measures do not weaken anything, and in fact tighten up a number of different areas. So it's a pretty straightforward one for here. Jumping to ICAT, this is the Atlantic and Mediterranean. I've got TBC just because the GTA Steering Committee has discussed this, is supportive of it, but it was just doing some internal checking with the various companies. But as of earlier today, I haven't heard anything back. Mako sharks. Short fin Makos are classified by IUCN as endangered, and they're also listed under CITES. They are, you can see by this Kobe plot on the left-hand side of the document, it's in the red, which essentially means it's overfished and overfishing is occurring. It's been estimated that recovery will likely take around about 25 years, even if the fishing mortality was cut to zero. There would be a 53% chance of rebuilding by 2045. The ICAT's own scientific committee recommended a ban on the retention of North Atlantic shortfin Makos and a limit of 2,001 tons of shortfin Mako in the South Atlantic. So that was their own internal advice at the ICAT meeting, and several countries supported this proposal at the ICAT meeting. However, in the 2019 meeting, the US, the EU, and the Curacao delegations offered complex counter proposals that fell far short of the scientific advice, and that would still allow hundreds of tons of North Atlantic Makos to continue to be landed. It really was a mind-blowing decision by these delegations, and it really puts paid to a lot of what's being said, certainly in US and EU delegations, on the priorities for sustainable fisheries. So the marketplace can certainly exert pressure on here about acting responsibly and actually following scientific advice to try to restore these populations of Mako sharks. They are caught in tuna fisheries. There's huge potential for reputational impact, as well as the biological impact on the species as well. So this is why we're talking about supporting Mako shark conservation as the priority individual focus area for ICAT. WCPFC, this is something I've mentioned earlier, the skipjack harvest strategies, also known as the MSC alignment issue. I mentioned this one. The skipjack fisheries in the West Central Pacific have a deadline imposed by the RFMO themselves to have a harvest strategy, harvest control rules in place by December 2021. If that doesn't occur, then the MSC certified fisheries in this region will have their certification suspended, all things being equal at this present moment in time. That could have impact in the supply chains for companies who have made sourcing decisions for MSC certified or equivalent who buy from this region as well. There is an alignment group, it's called, that is formed of the client groups in this fishery, and they have recently contacted the NGO Tuna Forum, ISSF and Global Tuna Alliance, amongst others, asking for support in having a variation request for this in the certification. So essentially what that would mean is they would allow some fluidity around this requirement. All these organizations were against this. We don't believe that this would support RFMO management of tuna fisheries by allowing them the opportunity to have this sort of fluidity around it. And instead, we believe the risks of allowing it to set a precedent are far more wide-ranging, both reputational for the MSC, but also for tuna fisheries worldwide who are going for MSC certification. So this is where, for the next 2 years, the focus will be at WCPFC, will be on skipjack harvest strategies and harvest control rules to address this point. So it's all very well talking about what our asks are of RFMOs. So how do we engage with RFMOs? I may have convinced you that it's important to do that, but it's not that easy to just get up and engage with RFMOs. So how are we proposing to do that? Well, there's two we believe there's two ways of doing it that are interlinked and joint. It's collaborative engagement and independent engagement. And what I've done here is I've just jotted down some examples of this. In starting with collaborative engagement, it's going to be difficult for companies to engage with RFMOs on their own and expect to get to influence change. Very few companies have the commercial might required to get country delegations to shift position. And this is why the Global Tuna Alliance was initially discussed and established 3 years ago, for this very reason of getting companies together pre-competitively to have a collective voice for RFMOs. So the first thing to do here is, if you are interested in this, one thing to do would be to join a representative organization. And I put, for example, the Global Tuna Alliance. We have a dedicated work program for RFMO engagement. Obviously, we're trying to support the implementation of the government partnerships commitment for the Tuna Traceability Declaration, but it's also a wider part of our work area. We have resources dedicated to this, and information is produced and provided to GTA partners to assist with engagement. By collaborating, you have a much louder voice. Like I say, when I go to meetings, if I'm there representing GTA and TUPA, I can say I am speaking on behalf of 27 companies now in Northwest Europe. The more countries and the wider geographic representation that we have, the louder our voice becomes. Collaborative engagement and outreach really works. It's useful to have independent companies going. It's very useful to have direct engagement. But if you can go then to say all these companies are calling for the same thing, that does have a knock-on effect. Such collaborative outreach and engagement includes things like side events at RFMOs that will be hosted on your behalf, meetings with delegates. And I want to flag that on April the 15th, the GTA partner meeting is taking place, and we have both the UK and the EU delegations joining us to not only hear our asks of the RFMOs, but to hear their positions as well. So we have an opportunity to engage with them directly. The more countries we're represented, the more delegates we can have these kind of meetings with as well. So in terms of the independent actions that you can take, and again, these are linked to the collaborative ones. The first one is develop an internal RFMO policy. And for example, just to have something that's written down that says we are committed to, for example, advocating for the increasing observer coverage in longline vessels and strengthening at-sea transshipment management by each of the world's tuna management organizations. And this explicitly sets out and publicly sets out what you are expecting of RFMOs to deliver tuna fishery sustainability, which can complement your wider sustainable seafood commitments. You can also include any consequences of no action. It will also alert your suppliers to your priorities and something to refer them to. The second thing is writing to the delegation's relevance. This is something obviously a collaborative organization will do as well with you as one of the signatories to the letter, but independent writing to delegations of relevance is very helpful. This would be not only the countries that you're based in, you're headquartered in, but countries you currently or wish to source from, to say, we have a stake in this, we're contributing to your economy, and we want the following. It informs the delegations that you have influence over your expectations as a commercially important stakeholder. Another thing to do is present asks in person. Contact delegates or their staff and present your asks in person where feasible. A face-to-face meeting can really amplify the importance you're putting on RFMOs to act on various measures such as harvest strategies, and sets out your expectations of the delegations. This is maybe not always feasible. You maybe not have the time, but again, this is something that will be done by collaborative organizations. Ask your suppliers to engage in RFMOs as well. And this includes MSC certified fisheries or regional FIPS, etc. By cascading your requirements to your suppliers and asking them to cascade to their suppliers or the producers, this further amplifies the message and also highlights the commercial importance of these things along your supply chain. It's no good just saying to RFMOs, we want action. If they're only hearing it from you, that you've got to be saying to your suppliers as well, this is important for us and we need you to play your part as well. Finally, attending RFMO meetings. This is something that could be very useful to do. By viewing the RFMO in action, you can see which delegates are supportive of measures. You can see which ones are blocking. You also have the opportunity to speak to a number of delegates at the same time. Again, it's not something that is expected of everyone. Representative organizations will be doing that, but I think it's useful to consider it, at least in one RFMO that's of major importance to your company. So what resources would an organization like the GTA have? Well, these is a typical set of resources that would be produced for each of the RFMOs. First of all, there'll be an overview for market actors, yourselves, and that would include a background to the asks, pretty much covering what I've covered here, but with a bit more technical detail and annexes to make sure that you have all the information to hand, so that if you were to ask something of someone, you would have the evidence for that ask and any information you needed. It would include the rationale. It would have specific actions that you can take, some of which I've covered in the previous slide. The second thing is would be a set of template text for letters or talking points, a boilerplate language that you can use in RFMO engagement. Include policy language that could be incorporated into your seafood sourcing commitments. Also, examples of text that you can send your suppliers asking for them to get involved. And finally, delegate details themselves, contact details for all the delegates at each RFMO. A lot of them have email addresses, and we've put it in Excel because they can be successfully used in mail merges. I have tried it once and it did work, and that was very useful. But it allows you to sort of quickly contact a number of delegations at one go to say, we're involved in this, and this is sort of the action we're looking to see. So this kind of information is going to be made available for each of the RFMOs. So wrapping it up now, making sure there's plenty of time for any questions. I've done some take-home messages. Number one, RFMOs have an essential role in tuna fisheries management. They really are important. They rarely hear the voices of the supply chain. Now, I am excluding the catching sector, who are often well represented, but they very rarely hear from members of the supply chain other than catchers. I've actually spoken to a couple of delegations, and they said, we have never heard from a retailer before, or a food service company, or a processor. And I'm not saying that no one's doing anything, but it really is welcomed by them. The Tuna Traceability Declaration Government Partnership Commitment calls on industry leaders to call on governments to take action needed to implement harvest strategies, which is one of the shared objectives, and establish systems to identify and restrict illegal seafood. And that would come under some of the measures we're calling for, such as better transshipment, 100% observer coverage. So what we're actually calling for does have a direct link to the government partnership commitment, certainly parts A and B. To achieve that, we're encouraging companies in the Tuna Traceability Declaration, who have signed the declaration, to partner with us, to participate in GTA-led RFMO engagement, but also to directly engage with RFMO delegates using the materials we produce. So it's a combination of collaborative work and individual action. So on that note, I will draw to a close and ask if anyone has any comments or any questions at all.
Can you hear me, Tom? This is Stephen.
Yes, I can.
Thank you very much for this very clear explanation. It was really interesting. I think you made it quite clear the whole way the alliance is going to work, and the importance of it. No need to say that I think that this is really an important move forward, because it indeed is a strange thing that all the other stakeholders in the chain are not involved with the RFMOs. And I think it's very important also because they have other interests, so to say, when it comes to sustainability than the main stakeholder that is involved, which is fisheries. And as you made it quite clear, the fisheries is very well organized on RFMO level, up to the point that you almost can say that they really steer a lot of the policies and the non-policies which are agreed upon in RFMO level. So I think this is really an important initiative. I had one specific question that was on the policies and the measures that you're proposing in the WCPFC, and then in particular on the skipjack, which is of course one of the most important stocks we have worldwide. So if in 2021 the harvest control rule is not set up, then for instance the MSC certification will be stopped. I wonder how this exactly is. Do you have any specific notice of the P&A countries? Because of course they have the biggest share of skipjack within the WCPFC, and their policies independently of the WCPFC are far more developed when it comes to harvest control rules. I'm not sure if you can call them like that, but at least they have a quite developed policies upon it, yet set in place. So I wondered if the WCPFC is not able to make it, their deadline to 2021. Is there any consideration for the P&A countries who do have their specific policies on a sustainable way of coping with their skipjack resources?
Yeah, a good question. And my understanding is that the P&A fishery could implement their own harvest strategy and harvest control rules out with the WCPFC, so that they could avoid this. But that is purely, I would say that's an understanding I have rather than a 100% guarantee. It's something that the P&A would be much better placed to answer, but that certainly is my understanding, Stephen.
Okay, but then there would be place, because strictly it's not an RFMO.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Regional organization, but they're very important. I mean, they have foremost the biggest chunk of the skipjack fisheries in the region. So if they are able to make their own harvest control rules without the RFMO, I mean, it would need some special attention to set upon, also for the other stakeholders in the chain, to make it clear that this is still responsible way of skipjack fisheries in the Western and Central Pacific.
That's right. And certainly for the next 2 years at least, the priority is to put pressure on the WCPFC to actually implement the harvest strategies that they have committed to themselves in their own work plans.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. Any other questions for any of our participants? No? Okay. Well, if you do have any thoughts afterwards, please feel free to email me. Happy to get back to you if you'd rather ask a question by email, or alternatively drop me a line, have a chat. I will be putting the presentation up online very shortly. So if you do need to share with anyone, I have recorded this webinar as well. So we will get this uploaded to the website as well if you need to share with any colleagues. Thank you very much for joining. And if you do have any feedback on this webinar or any other webinars that we've done, please don't hesitate to let me know. The next webinar, we take a break for because we had some time for Boston, which obviously is not happening anymore. But the next presentation, I believe, is going to be on the 23rd of March, which will be on GSSI. So hopefully we'll see you there as well. So thank you very much for joining. And if you, like I say, if you do have any comments or questions, please don't hesitate to let me know. Thank you.
Thank you.